The Locked Room. Don't forget to subscribe and bell icon. Let's start without wasting your time. Eli Turner was no ordinary man. By the age of 35, he had traveled the world, performing feats most would deem impossible. He was an escape artist, perhaps the greatest the world had ever known. Whether bound in chains, submerged underwater, or locked in cages, Eli always found his way out, to the astonishment of audiences who flocked to his shows. But tonight was different. Eli had just finished his final performance in Los Angeles, a record-breaking show that had drawn an international crowd. The applause still echoed in his mind as he retreated to his dressing room, weary but satisfied. As he splashed water on his face, preparing to unwind, a sudden sharp pain pierced the back of his neck. The world around him spun, darkness swallowing him whole. When Eli awoke, he was no longer in his dressing room. His head pounded as his eyes adjusted to the dim light of his surroundings. The cold concrete walls, the musty air, and the eerie silence told him everything he needed to know. He was a prisoner. He quickly assessed the room. It was small, with only a single door locked, of course, and no windows. Ellie's heart raced, but not from fear. Years of escaping impossible situations had trained him to control his emotions. Fear clouded the mind, and right now, his mind needed to be sharp. Standing up, Eli noticed a camera in the corner of the ceiling, its red light blinking. Someone was watching him. He approached the door and inspected the lock. It was a complex mechanism, far beyond the average deadbolt, but to Eli, it was just another puzzle waiting to be solved. He dug into his pocket, instinctively reaching for the thin strip of metal he always carried, a makeshift lockpick that had saved him on countless occasions. But his pockets were empty. Everything had been stripped from him. His tools, his phone, even his watch. Whoever had placed him here knew exactly who he was and how to prepare. Just as he was about to take a closer look at the lock, a loudspeaker crackled to life. "Good evening, Eli." The voice was deep, calm, and eerily familiar, though Eli couldn't place it. "You've entertained millions with your so-called escapes, but tonight, the real test begins. This isn't a show, Eli. This is a game with no audience, no applause, and no second chances." Ellie's pulse quickened. "You will face a series of rooms, each designed specifically for you. Each one will test not just your skill, but your mind. If you can escape all the rooms, you will be free. If not, well, you'll never have to worry about performing again." The speaker went silent. Ellie's mind raced. A series of rooms? Designed for him? It was clear now this wasn't some random kidnapping. This was personal. Someone had studied him, learned his weaknesses, and was determined to break him.
Eli forced himself to stay calm. He had been in tight spots before, and this was just another one. If someone had built this to challenge him, they had underestimated his determination. He turned back to the door. Without his tools, he needed to get creative. He scanned the room for anything useful. A rusty nail protruded from the wall near the floor, small, but it might be enough. Eli bent down, wiggling it free, and carefully inserted it into the lock. His hands moved with the precision of a surgeon, feeling every tiny mechanism inside. After several minutes, there was a satisfying click. The door swung open. Eli stepped through, only to find himself in a hallway lined with metal doors. A shiver ran down his spine. This wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. He approached the next door, which stood ajar. Inside was a larger room, dimly lit, with walls lined with mirrors. In the center of the room was a chair, and on the chair, a pair of handcuffs. Next to the chair was a table, and on the table, a timer counting down from 10 minutes. Eli's breath caught. He recognized this setup. It was a replica of one of his most famous acts, where he had been shackled in handcuffs, bound by chains, and submerged underwater. But this time, there was no water, and no audience. He knew the game. He had to handcuff himself to the chair. There was no way forward unless he played along. Reluctantly, he sat down, locking the cuffs around his wrists. Almost immediately, the timer began ticking down faster, the seconds vanishing in rapid succession. Then, the walls began to close in ever so slowly. The room was shrinking. Eli's heart raced as he strained against the cuffs. He knew how to escape handcuffs, but the added pressure of the walls closing in made it harder to focus. He contorted his body, twisting his wrists in a familiar motion, using the edge of the chair to push against the lock on the cuffs. The seconds flew by. With a final twist, the cuffs clicked open. Eli leapt from the chair, just as the walls were about to crush him. He barely made it out the door before the walls sealed shut behind him. Sweat dripped down his face. That was too close. But there was no time to rest. Another door awaited him. This time, the room was different. It was cold freezing, in fact. A layer of frost covered the walls, and his breath came out in visible puffs. In the center of the room was a tank filled with icy water. Suspended above the tank was a key, dangling just out of reach. Eli's teeth chattered as he approached the tank. He knew what he had to do. He had to dive in, retrieve the key, and unlock the door before hypothermia set in. But the water was so cold it would shock his system the moment he entered. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and plunged into the water. The cold hit him like a sledgehammer, stealing the breath from his lungs. His fingers fumbled as he reached for the key, his body trembling uncontrollably.
Finally, his hand closed around the key. He pulled himself out of the water, his limbs numb and heavy. His hands shook as he inserted the key into the door's lock, turning it just in time. As the door opened, Eli collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. His body was freezing, and every muscle ached, but he had survived. Barely. He staggered to his feet, knowing he couldn't stop. There were more rooms ahead, and each one would be more dangerous than the last. The next room was pitch black, save for a small light above the door on the far side. As he stepped inside, the floor shifted beneath his feet, revealing a series of narrow beams suspended over a deep chasm. One wrong step and he'd fall to his death. Eli steadied himself, his senses heightened. He had walked tightropes before, but never under these conditions. Slowly, carefully, he made his way across, his arms outstretched for balance. His heart pounded in his chest, each step more precarious than the last. Halfway across, the beams began to sway. Eli's foot slipped, and for a heart-stopping moment, he teetered on the edge. But his reflexes saved him. He caught himself and pressed forward, his determination stronger than ever. When he finally reached the other side, his legs were trembling, but he had made it. Another room conquered, but as he opened the door to the next challenge, something changed. The room wasn't a trap or a puzzle. It was a living room. His living room. Photos of his family adorned the walls, and familiar furniture filled the space. In the center of the room stood a figure tall, broad-shouldered, with the face obscured by shadow. Eli's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" Eli demanded, his voice hoarse. The figure stepped forward, and Eli finally saw his face. It was someone he hadn't seen in years. A man who had once been his closest friend but had disappeared after a falling out. "Max," Eli whispered, disbelief flooding his voice. Max smiled, a cold, twisted smile. "I told you, Eli, one day, I'd make you pay for what you did, for leaving me behind." Eli's mind raced as the pieces clicked into place. Max had been the architect of this nightmare, the one pulling the strings. This wasn't just a game, it was revenge. And now, face to face with his enemy, Eli realized that the real escape wasn't from the rooms, it was from the past.